So now I'm happy to introduce our speaker. Our speaker for tonight is Joanna Wu. She's a PhD student studying female birds at the University of California, Los Angeles. She previously worked at the National Audubon Society and is a member of the Galbatross Project, a group of birders, scientists, writers, and conservationists who are passionate about spreading awareness about female birds. So that's really cool. I've had the pleasure of meeting Joanna in person a couple of times through conferences, and I'm really happy that she accepted our invitation to speak to our chapter tonight and tell everyone about the importance of female birds. So thank you, Joanna, and I'm going to make you the host. Okay, and then you'll be able to share your screen and present.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Hannah, and thank you everyone for being with me today. Let me just get my, great. Let me know if at any point you're having trouble seeing my slides. I'm using a new computer. And first of all, I appreciate all that you guys are doing with inviting children to and families to participate. That's and also increasing accessibility. I think that's really important work. It's neat to hear about that. Okay, so my presentation will roughly follow this format here. First, I'm going to talk about why female birds specifically. I said in the title that they're often overlooked, and I'm going to kind of give some examples of how we do it just without thinking. I'm going to talk about Female Bird Day and the Galbatross Project, give you some identification tips, and then finally end on how hard it can be to pay attention to female birds in particular, and talk about female bird song. In this presentation, there are some parts that are certainly interactive, so feel free to put your comments in the chat. Otherwise, I won't be able to see the chat very much during the presentation, but like Hannah said, I'll be happy to take questions at the end. Okay, so the first part, why female birds? Well, I went to Google birds for this presentation, and here are the first three that came up: a bright Baltimore oriole, a beautiful blue jay, and a bright red scarlet tanager. So as humans, we are very visual creatures, and colors especially are things that pop up to us just evolutionarily. And as we know, in birds, males more often tend to be the brighter sex, so they're often more conspicuous and easier to see. So from the get-go, our eyes just have a tendency to focus on the brighter colors. So I want to start off with a fun little bird quiz. Does anyone know the identity of this bird? Please drop it in the chat if you do or have a guess. There are no wrong answers. It's really just for fun. Awesome. I think someone said scarlet tanager, which is exactly what this bird is. She's a female scarlet tanager, which just looks so different from the bright red. And you can see that unlike the male, she's kind of set up to blend in and not stand out. Okay. In general, male birds are more colorful than females in many species. Here's a panel from a paper that looked at primarily at tropical birds. So in the top three are cases where males are much brighter than females, but the birds in the bottom three are examples where the females are just as bright as the males. So those are blue-winged mountain tanager, crimson collared tanager, and chestnut cap brush finch. And of course, we have exceptions to that rule where the red phalarope and red-necked phalarope are examples of birds where the female is significantly brighter than the male during the breeding season. This is because females have multiple mates, as you may know, and do not do parental care duties, whereas her mates will incubate the eggs. The sex role reversal, as we call it, is very uncommon in the bird world. And that's partially why these are some of the only species where females have brighter plumage. So where this shows up is one very obvious place is in bird watching. Our eyes just tend to be drawn to the brighter species. This also shows up in the naming of birds. The bird on the left is the blue grosbeak, but when you look at the female, there's nothing blue about her, and it can be really difficult to even identify this species without the male present. Of course, we have the red-winged blackbird, and there's a picture of a male and a female together, but the female is a bird that almost always gives me pause when I see it for the first time, in the year, and I always jump right to sparrow because she kind of looks streaky like one. Here's a little naming, kind of a little poetic blurb about naming that the naturalist Florence Mariam Bailey wrote. Like other ladies, the little feathered brides have to bear their husbands' names, however inappropriate. What injustice! Here an innocent creature with an olive green back and yellowish breast has to go all her days known as a black-throated blue warbler, just because that happens to describe the dress of her spouse. I'm sure you all know how hard it is to identify warblers that are female or juveniles because a lot of them look very similar. So that goes to show that the name doesn't even describe what the bird looks like when you're a female. Of course, this is manifested in photography and art as well. You'll almost never see a Christmas card with a female cardinal featured on it. So I'm going to explain quickly two terms that I'm going to be using. A lot of you will have known these already. One is dimorphic. It's where female and male birds of the same species look different from each other. Dimorphic, two morphs here. Example on the bottom is California quail. Another example that's really neat is the Eclectus parrot. We've got the male that's green and the female that's red. I read that when they first tried to breed them in the zoo, they were wondering why the red birds weren't breeding and the green birds weren't breeding, but it turned out that they thought they were two different species and so had separated the males from the females, and that's why they weren't breeding. But in nature, females, both sexes have a promiscuous mating nature where they have multiple mates. And the females defend her territory against other females, which is why she's bright. And the male is green and blends in with the forest foliage because he goes around the forest and finds food and feeds all of his mates. In contrast is a bird that's monomorphic, which has one morph in the adult form. An example here is the black-crowned night heron. I don't really know of a good way to tell them apart by sex visually. So a lot of my work here is inspired by this article and a couple of others that I'm going to show next. One is by the naturalist Ken Kaufman, who wrote an article for the Audubon titled, "I Became a Better Birder When I Stopped Focusing on the Males." And in the first sentence, he writes that he once knew a birder that would not count a bird as on his list unless he saw an adult male. I don't think this is necessarily biased against females per se, but as I said, just the fact that they're less flashy and less beautiful. How many of us have gone to the field and said, "Oh, it's a Western tanager, but it's only a female." I think I've done that myself when I was hoping to see something bright and beautiful. But this is one of those articles that challenge us to really think that birding is not all about identifying only one type of bird. This one is one that has heavily influenced me as a researcher. This paper by Dr. Ruth Bennett and collaborators found that in the golden winged warbler, the sexes actually overwinter in different habitat types in Latin America. So the female golden winged warbler uses drier, shrubbier habitats, and the male golden winged warbler uses higher elevation broadleaf forests. These low elevation habitats have been subject to greater logging because they're easier to access than going up higher in the mountain. And so she found that between that over a time span in the early 2000s, that the female golden wing warbler has lost twice as much overwintering habitat as the males. And of course, that has huge implications for the conservation of the species because females may not be surviving overwinter as well as males do. So it turns out that this type of pattern is pretty often seen in the literature for warblers. The black and white warblers also show this type of segregation or separation of habitat use in the overwintering grounds. This chart essentially shows that females, same thing, tend to use understory and mid canopy more than males birds. So even within, the last example was about geographic separation, but then even within the same space, the females use different heights of vegetation than the males. And the study also looked at the body condition of males and females and found that females seemed to be less fit, had a lower body condition than males did after the overwintering season. In another example of a different taxon, in the wandering albatross, males are slightly larger, so they, let me think about that. Females, yes, females are smaller, so they use more northern habitats that they actually, when they're out to sea, they use more northern latitudes than males. And some researchers have found that they have been caught more in long line fishing lines because those tend to be where fishing happens more than for the other species, for the other sex, excuse me. Another last study I'll show you here is about whether climate change has any impacts on birds. We know that climate change is no longer a problem of the future, but it's one of the biggest environmental problems of the present. This paper about wedge-tailed shearwaters found that because this is a burrow nesting bird, that where the female does the incubation duties, the burrow is more prone to flood events related to climate change. So there's direct fitness consequences to the female that the male incurs to a much lesser extent. So I hope I've convinced you that with a couple of scientific studies out of several that there are conservation and fitness consequences of overlooking females because they don't always do the same thing as males do. I then want to talk a little bit about Female Bird Day and the Galbatross Project. So essentially, how can you get involved? What can you do? How can you start and think about female birds in a different light? So I'm part of a small group of conservationists and writers who call ourselves the Galbatross Project. It was established in spring of 2019, where we went out to do the World Series of birding in New Jersey. And since then, we've made something called the Female Bird Day every year. It's actually over Memorial Weekend, so several days where we essentially advertise about female birds on Twitter, social media, and try to get people to send us their observations about female birds. And the goal is to promote word about female birds and the fact that they can easily be overlooked. So just helping people get out and bird and look for females. This is the 5 of us, Brooke, Stephanie, Martha, Perdita, and I. And the 3 of them went out to do the World Series of birding in that year and actually decided only to look for female birds, knowing that they had no real chance at winning that competition. And it turns out that they found a total of 31 species of female birds that day. And they were the second to last team to come in following a group of toddlers and children. So they definitely struggled a lot with looking for female birds and not being able to identify a certain bird as a female in a lot of cases. So speaking of identification, I just want to talk a little bit about identification tips and what to look for. There's a couple of categories here. Obviously, birds can be visibly dimorphic in the greater sage grouse and a lot of galliforms. The male and female look really different from each other. Another example is the house finch, where the male has that bright red head. This is one where it's very difficult to tell a female from an immature, but in this case, one clue that you might be able to use is the time of year. Like if it's very early spring, it's likely an adult female, whereas in the fall, immatures can look like this brown bird on the right as well. Here is a fun one that you might know, and it's from the cover of this talk. The belted kingfisher is actually named for the rust-colored belt that the female has, whereas the male just has a white belly. And then here's another quiz for anyone who'd like to participate. Please give me the species ID of the larger woodpecker on the feeder. Yeah, this is a fun one because I mix up this. It's easy to mix up these two species in the field, but then when you see them in a picture side by side, you can really see the size difference. Yeah, right. So, yep, awesome. Hairy woodpecker. The male has a red spot on his head and the female does not. Here is another one. Does anyone know which bird is the male and female in the northern flicker pair? You can just say like left or right or something like that in the chat. The flicker is definitely one that I didn't know was visibly dimorphic, but the male actually has that black mustache spot under his bill, whereas the female does not. So that's a pretty subtle but visible tip here. Okay, I think one of my favorite examples, I'm gonna try to play it, is the wren tit from California. Let me know if you can hear the song playing from my computer. Oh, I don't think I had shared computer sound on. Oh, okay. Sorry about that. I don't think that. Oh, you can hear it. Great. Got it. So that downward ping pong ball is the male song, but the females has a different song. So in this case, the female ends by not trilling, so it doesn't, the speed doesn't stays the same toward the end of her song. Whereas for males, this is the male again. The male song ends by accelerating toward the end, like a ping pong ball dropping really fast. These birds both defend a shared territory, so they think that's why both sexes sing. They look very similar to each other as well. This is the American kestrel, and in raptors, as some of you may know, females tend to be larger than males. It's hard to tell though, and of course for the kestrel, you can rely on plumage cues to tell this trait. I've talked about females having a lower fitness than males, which is true for a lot of species, but in the case of the kestrel, when they've done experiments removing the bigger female from a habitat, the males will move in, which suggests that the females may be excluding males from better quality habitats. Here's another quiz for you. What is the species of the bird on the left there? Again, a raptor where the female is much larger than the male. Okay, here we go. And then on the right, it's the same thing. The female is larger than the male. Does anyone want to guess about this raptor on the left here? You might be wondering Coopers or sharp-shinned, in which case it's almost impossible to tell. And yeah, it would be Coopers. They have a more rounded tail and spread out. In terms of the great horned owl, I won't play the call, but please go and look up the great horned owl songs if you don't know those, because the females have a higher pitched hooting call and the males have a lower pitched one, even though he's smaller. And they call to each other, often duetting, which is really neat to hear. Okay, another type of dimorphism is that they can be behaviorally dimorphic. In chickadees, for example, you can't really tell them apart by looking at them, but only females are the only ones that build a nest and incubate and do the nest duties. This on the right is a nest from my bird feeder where there's a couple of baby chickadees just hatching there, and they had built the nest out of dog fur, presumably from my neighbor's dog. Similarly to that example, in tree swallows, females remove fecal sacs over twice as much as males do. So if you see a swallow removing a fecal sac, it's most likely the female. So those are some types of behavioral cues, and you might have surmised by now that it's hard. It's really challenging to figure out sometimes whether you're looking at a female bird or a male. And that's why we have a lot less scientific data that's sex specific, where we can look at habitat use, for example, by sexes. It's hard to collect that information, but I'm hoping in my PhD to write some reviews about that and to maybe collect some of my own data. So a species that's supposed to be dimorphic is the mourning dove. The males have a slightly bluer coloration around the eye and brighter plumage, but it's really subtle. So in this pair, for example, I'm not 100% sure which one is the male or the female. Birds like the eastern towhee have males are brighter black and the females tend to be more brown, but again, the immature can have that look as well. So depending on the season, you'll want to be careful about that. Oh, so I don't know if people know about this, but here's a pair of American avocets copulating. I think they have a really, really neat dimorphism where the male has a longer and straighter beak, and the beak of the female is shorter and it's more curved up. This is probably due to the fact that they have slight diet differentiation, so they don't have to compete with each other quite as much, but it is so subtle, and if they're not next to each other, it's incredibly hard to tell whether that beak is actually long or slightly curvier. Birds like the American coot are ones you really can't ID by sex in the field. And birds like hummingbirds, a lot of times will, the juvenile will, you can't really tell a juvenile from a female, but if you saw it in California, if you were to see one in December that looked like this, I would be pretty comfortable that it's a female, but even a couple months after that, it could be a juvenile. And then fall migration, which is a bigger phenomenon for you all, is a very, very challenging time. I've got two yellow warblers here, and one was labeled as a female, one was labeled as immature, but really they look identical to me, especially during fall. It's very challenging to tell the sexes apart. Sorry, it's very challenging to tell females apart from juveniles. Another example is a song sparrow. This is a bird that is not visibly dimorphic, but only the males sing. So that's another clue that you can use to tell males apart. But of course, as you saw in the earlier presentation, not all birds that sing are males. Females indeed do sing. And this is one of the landmark papers by some fantastic researchers that found that that of the species where we know information about who is singing, two-thirds of those species have females that have female song present, whereas about a third of those species don't have any female songs. So they basically found that after an extensive survey that the female song is more prevalent than we had previously thought. There were early ornithologists who said that, oh, males sing songs and females just call. But in fact, we're finding that this is not true. And there's several prominent research labs across the US that are studying specifically female birdsong and diving more into this realm. In fact, the authors of this work wrote to the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and said, hey, on your webpage, you only write songs and calls. You know, you're assuming that males are the only ones that do the singing, when in fact, in X, Y, and Z species, we know that females sing as well. So Cornell actually went back and added female song for some wrens, which are some of their studied species, and also the wren tit and a number of other songs where they now know that females have a different song. Why do females sing? Well, it's very much for the same reasons that males sing. It's a trait that is thought to be more ancestral or something that's characteristic of birds from the older world. Sometimes in some species, it's been lost in New World species, which are species in the Americas. Although in the Americas, it tends to be associated with tropical birds that hold year-round territories. So both males and females are singing to defend territories. They're communicating with each other and with the neighbors. And they're more often found in species that have similar sex roles where they share parental duties, for example. So I'm nearing the end of my presentation, and I want to talk about a couple of fun things here. As Hannah mentioned, I used to work for the National Audubon, and I was going through our photo database searching for pictures of female birds, and I found that almost all the warblers we had, almost all the species where males are bright and beautiful, I found that we often don't even have a female representation, so I don't even know what some of those warblers look like in the female version. So I actually mentioned this casually to our director of photography once, and she remembered that. And you know, a year later, she approached me and said, hey, we were thinking about making a female bird prize to add to the Audubon Photography Awards, which the winners have just been announced, and you should take a look because the photos are phenomenal as always. So anyway, she announced, so they came up with a new female bird prize of $1,000 for starting in 2021. And us albatrosses were very lucky to be able to judge that. It was fantastic looking through so many photos of otherwise drabber birds. And also reading the descriptions by the photographers of why they think this bird is a female. For example, they might have noticed it incubating in a species that's not dimorphic or some kind of behavior like that. So it takes a lot more time to really look for female birds. But this is the winner that we identified by Elizabeth E. Cheng Shen of a northern harrier, and she's a female because the males have a grayer plumage. This is also an adult bird because the juveniles are more streaked and more orange. So yeah, it was neat to do this kind of outreach and be able to draw people's attentions. Hopefully we got some photographers going out there and trying to figure out how to identify female birds in the field. So in conclusion, there's a couple of takeaways is that females are not just like the males. In a lot of scientific studies, we lump the sexes together when we do a particular analysis, and they don't always use the same resources as males. They don't always behave the same way. They can sing, and they often have a distinct song from males. And lastly, I just encourage you to join us and bird the challenge, because as I've mentioned numerous times, it's really difficult to identify female birds in a lot of the case. Some of the questions that really interest me and that we maybe barely have any information on is there a differential impact of anthropogenic change, like habitat modification, on males and females? That example of the golden wing warbler is one where females did have a conservation and fitness impact, but that's impacted by humans. And also, does climate change impact the sexes differently? We know that females are, of course, the drivers of productivity, of producing birds and ensuring their survival. So how can we ensure the survival of females and thus the survival of the species going forward? How can we best move conservation in light of considering both sexes? If you are on social media, you can join us by using these hashtags, hashtag female bird and Galbatross project. And during Memorial Weekend, please challenge yourself to look for as many female birds as you can. On eBird, you can enter them in, but right now you have to do that through the desktop version of eBird. I'm thinking about talking to them and seeing if they can put it in the app so we can use that, enter that data in the field, and that way it can be more readily collected. Here is another fun collaboration with Rosemary Moscow, who is an amazing scientific illustrator and naturalist herself. She got word of the Galbatross project and illustrated a panel of female birds for Female Bird Day. It's a beautiful little poster, and if you're interested, you can find it on this website here, and I can share the link if anyone would like it. So yeah, this is the last of my presentation. I want to end on another fun and crazy fact here, which I have a picture of black oyster catchers, but it's the same for the American oyster catcher. If you look at the eye specks, the female often has a black eye speck coming out of the iris, whereas the male has just a typical clear, a typical dot without any patternation around it. We don't know why that's the case, but the females, I think a study found 95% of the time you can identify sexes by looking for the eye speck, if you're lucky and get close enough to them. Oyster catchers also have slightly different bill morphology, so the males and females feed on slightly different types of food. So there's so much subtlety to be considered in the world of male and female birds. Well, Hannah, that's it from me. I'm happy to take any questions or however you want to coordinate that.
Yeah, great. I will. So if you guys have questions, you can write them in the chat box, and I'm happy to read them out to Joanna. Or if you want to ask your question yourself, like I said earlier, you can write in the chat box that you'd like to do that, and we can unmute you. So, yeah, so put those questions in the chat box. And thank you, Joanna. That presentation was awesome. I learned some new things. I really like the picture of the great horned owls and the one being so much bigger. I thought that was a good contrast. So yeah, if anyone has questions, please put them in the chat. Otherwise, that was the meeting. That was the presentation. So thank you everyone for attending. Glad you guys could make it.
I have to say I had a hard time finding that great horned owl picture. They often don't look that different in size from the pictures I was seeing, and I've personally never been able to tell their size very well in owl birding, but the tone of their hoots is definitely a good key.
Cool. Yeah. So I don't know if you see the question, Joanna, but is there a way to tell the difference between male and female blue jays or mockingbirds?
Yeah, that's a good question. There is a way to tell apart male and female blue jays, but I cannot remember what it is because I don't have any blue jays. And my friends on the East Coast told me once, but it's very subtle. So there is a way. You might have to. I would suggest going to Birds of North America to look up and see if they have any tips. That's usually where I start. I can also follow up and send you the tip because I just don't remember on the top of my head, and they look very similar from each other. In terms of mockingbirds, that's a great question. I think they look the same as each other, but I'm thinking of do males sing more than females, for example? That's yeah, I don't actually know. That's a very good question. I believe both sexes sing, but I'm not 100% sure. I'll have to look it up.
Does anyone else have any questions? All right, well, thank you again, Joanna. And for everyone else, that's the end of the meeting. Thank you for attending and hope to see you next month.
All right, bye.